Hello there, lovely folks of YouTube, Ren here. I wanted to talk today about one of the most unusual plants I have in my garden. It is the plant that is probably the hardest to grow. Doesn't give me very much yield, but it is so rewarding when I do get something from it. That is this little vine behind me. This is the Clitoria ternatea, which is also known as Asian pigeonwing or butterfly pea. This is a plant that is native to equatorial Southeast Asia. It is perennial in its native habitat, which is zones 11 to 12. I do not live in zones 11 to 12. Here where I live in zone 7, it can be grown as an annual, but it's very difficult to do so. I'll get into that in a moment. Let's talk a little bit more about the basics of the plant here. So this plant is in the Fabaceae or the legume family. It is actually a pea. It's in that family. Like most plants in that family, it has these very long, creeping, trailing stems that it will grow everywhere. So this particular plant can grow in its native habitat up to 15 feet in length. I'm lucky to get to about 5 to 6 feet on mine, just because it doesn't like the cold and it will once it gets frost. So the genus name for this plant is named for the clitoris, because that's what the flowers are said to resemble. And in the single blooming variety, it is a definite resemblance. My particular plant here, this is the double flowered variety, so the resemblance is not quite as clear, but if you see any photos of the single blooming variety, you'll be like, yeah, I see where it got that name. So the flowers are its most noticeable characteristic. I mean, you can see this is just a gorgeous color, just gorgeous. That brilliant electric blue color really stands out. The flowers grow usually singly, but sometimes in pairs everywhere where there's a leaf node, and each flower usually only lasts about 1 day. So you can see, like, all these leaf nodes down here, some of them have already made flowers. This one is blooming now. This one will probably bloom tomorrow, and then it'll just keep growing up and elsewhere, more flowers. If you leave the flowers be, they will eventually, assuming they're pollinated, turn into sort of a flattened seed pod, like a pea pod. That can hold up to 10 seeds, and the seeds are just small, flattened, sort of grayish-brown speckled seeds. They're nothing really special about them. As I mentioned, it can be grown in colder climates. I can grow it here in Zone 7. It grows as an annual. It's never going to reach its full size, and it really needs a lot of heat. Like, we're here in August, and you can see this plant is really just now starting to take off. I'll get maybe a month's worth of good flowers out of it, and then it'll be done. If you live somewhere that's a little colder than I am, like where I grew up in the Midwest, you might not even get it to the point where it even flowers, unless you give it some protection, like growing it in a greenhouse or something like that. You can grow them in greenhouses. However, I do have to warn you that they are susceptible to spider mites when they're grown indoors, which is a nightmare, so just be warned about that. Plant does like full sun, sometimes likes a little afternoon shade, but for the most part likes full sun. Also likes things wet. Needs a lot of even moisture as well. So this is a plant that needs quite a bit of babying to grow here where I am. So as you can imagine, you can't really find this plant anywhere. You have to grow it from seed. It is a pain in the butt to grow from seed. So the seeds that I mentioned, those little itty bitty seeds, have a really, really hard, extra thick seed coat on them. Basically, in order to get the seeds to even begin to germinate, you have to soak the seeds in water, and non-chlorinated water, so like a rainwater or spring water, bottled water, for at least 24 hours. If the seed starts to swell a little bit, then you're kind of got something you're going with. If after 24 hours the seed is just as hard and firm as it was when you first put it in the water, you then have to scarify that seed. And what that means is you kind of have to scratch or injure that seed coat in some way without damaging the embryo underneath, in order to kind of get the water into where that embryo is. My preferred method for doing that is actually a nail file or an emery board. I just kind of rough it up a little bit on the nail file, Put it back in the water, give it another 24 hours. Make sure you're changing the water in between each one, because you don't want any of those inhibitory chemicals that prevent germination to be remaining in the water. So you change out the water, try it for another 24 hours, and then once it starts to soften, then you can plant it in your seed starter mix. Once they're in the seed starter mix, it has to stay moist and humid the whole time, or it will not germinate at all. I actually grow these seeds rather than putting them in my little seed starter tray with my other seeds. I have a little mini greenhouse that I use just for these seeds in order to get them to germinate. And even then, like, even if you do everything right, like, my average germination rate is only about 50%. So I actually got lucky this year. I started with 8 seeds. I had 7 of them germinate, which is a new record for me. Usually it's only about 3 or 4. Had 7 of them germinate. So keep growing them indoors until well after your last frost. Ideally, these plants don't like anything under 60 degrees. So even if the nighttime temps drop below 60 degrees, they really shouldn't be outside. So I think I planted mine out in May? Mid to late May was when I planted mine out. And even then, it's kind of a crapshoot. So you know how I said I had 7 of them that germinated? Yeah, of the 7 that I planted, I only have 3 that actually survived. And of those 3 that survived, you can see I only have 1 that's actually grown big enough to make any flowers. The other 2 are only like 8 to 10 inches tall right now, and just barely starting to put out tendrils that will grow on my trellis. It does need a support to grow on. As you can see, I plant mine along my trellis and then they grow up onto my deck, because again, it is a vine. So it's hard to grow. I feel like it's worth it, but just be warned, it is a challenge. So hope you're up for it. The flowers here, I know I mentioned that these flowers only last for a day. That means that if you want to harvest the flowers, you have to come out here every day to pick flowers. Every day, gotta pick flowers. So this little flower right here, we actually had a little rain squall, so it's kind of wet and I can't pick it. I figured since I can't pick the flower, I may as well make a video about it. So that way at least I'm getting something out of it, even if I can't get the flower off of it. So let's talk about some magical uses of this plant. So as you can imagine, we don't have a lot of historical magical information. Most of the other plants that I'm talking about, they're plants that have a long history of magical uses in Western traditions. They've been talked about by Culpeper, by Paracelsus, by all these other people with magical backgrounds. But this is a plant that is not native to Europe. This is a plant that is really only coming into the cultural consciousness outside of its native area very recently. I actually found out about this plant about 5 years ago due to a seed catalog that I order from. But I'm starting to see more information online about this plant now. So we really don't have a lot of Western magical tradition information on this plant. We kind of have to go on a few resources from the native cultures that engage with this plant, which of course we're limited on because I don't have any, I don't have the ability to speak or read Thai, for example. And that would be like one of the cultures that uses this plant pretty widely. But we do know there's a few little stories that are out there. So I know that Ayurvedic medical texts, basically talking about herbal medicine in the Ayurvedic system, they talk about this plant's effects on the nervous system. This plant is also sometimes used as an aphrodisiac, and particularly an aphrodisiac for women, probably due to that symbolism of the flower. We also know that in Hinduism, this flower is sometimes used in the devotional worship of Shiva, so which is kind of interesting, a little tidbit to file away. There's a story in Thai mythology about how this plant came to humanity, and the plant was given to a woman named Isra, which translates, that name means like a nocturnal journey or a dream journey. And Isra, she was visited in a dream by a Kinari, which is sort of a beneficial spirit that's part woman, part bird. And this spirit is like one of the spirits that guards the well-being of humans, and this spirit took her on this journey and showed her this plant and taught her how to cultivate this plant and share it with mankind. And that's how the cultivation of the butterfly pea came to that area, according to mythology. So we also have to look at the nature of the plant itself. So I mean, obviously anything that's in the pea family traditionally has always been attributed to Venus astrologically, and its use as an aphrodisiac for women could support that use as well. But when I look at this plant with that really bright electric blue flower, the habit of just kind of like growing any which way it wants, and in particularly its use in Ayurvedic medicine as having effects on the nervous system, this plant, to me, that implies that it might have some rulership under the planet Uranus. And if you're not familiar with that particular planet in astrology, it is one of the newer planets, so there's not a lot, you know, there's a more recent history for that planet in astrology, but it is considered to be the planet that rules innovation, originality, change and transformation, and divine inspiration. Okay, and one of the other things as well that kind of implies for me that this might be a Uranus rulership is one of the more very well-known properties of the butterfly pea flower tea is that it naturally is that same bright electric blue color as the flowers, but if you add acid to it, the color will transform and change into this really electric purple color instead. So that ability to transform from blue to purple with the addition of acid, which is usually lemon juice, but other things will work as well, is probably one of the reasons why it's so popular these days. Everyone's like, ooh, it's magical. It looks really cool. It's a fun trick. It's basically the same principles behind litmus paper, but it still looks cool. It's fun. But at its root, though, we can look at that transformation that it undergoes and say that this is probably a Uranus property, and being under the rulership of Uranus would mean that this plant is going to be something that would be good for any magic for things that Uranus would be good for. So that would be things like breaking old thought patterns, clearing away obstacles to new growth, any kind of personal changes or transformations as a society as well. So those are all things that we could potentially use this plant for magically. Or you could just throw it in an aphrodisiac and see if that works for you too. Honestly, we don't really, you know, it's all kind of trial and error at this point. You know, we don't have like a verified set of correspondences for this plant. We're still kind of just throwing our own unverified personal gnosis out there. So this one is mine. Take it as you will. If you have worked with this plant and you have found that it's been efficacious for you in certain things, I would like to hear about it, because I'm all interested about learning, especially about plants. I love learning about plants. If you're new to this plant, I highly recommend you check it out, if for no other reason than just because it does make a really cool looking tea. I mean, that blue color is stunning, just stunning. It can be obtained online. I know I've seen it advertised on Amazon even. I'm sure you can probably find it in any ethnic markets that cater to people who are from the Southeast Asia or India, Indian subcontinent, because it is very commonly used in both of those areas. But other than that, I hope you gleaned a little bit of information out of this, and maybe you'll be willing to take up the challenge and try to grow your own butterfly pea. Who knows? It is a challenge, but I think it's worth it. So anyway, I hope this video finds you well, and I'll see you again soon.